She was alive, in a cage. Police found a sealed metal door hidden beneath a suburban house. Behind it, a girl missing for 80 days, and another just arrived. Who built this prison? And why didn't anyone stop him sooner? The room was quiet, but it was not peace. It was the kind of silence found only underground, stale, claustrophobic, and absolute. The walls were yellow, not by design but by disguise, painted recently to cover the darker stains beneath. At the center stood a narrow bed frame with no sheets, just a thin foam mattress stained with moisture and age. The only window was not a window at all, but a single exposed light bulb humming faintly above. Along one wall, a child's drawing had been ripped and taped back together, its corners curled from damp. Near the entrance, there was a crate, steel, narrow, lined inside with coarse fabric and fitted with a lock welded shut. Whoever built it had calculated not just the dimensions of a body, but the proportions of fear. This space was not made to kill, it was made to erase. On May 28, 1996, around 7:25 a.m., a 12-year-old girl named Sabine Dardenne left her home in the Belgian city of Tournai for her usual bike ride to school. She waved to her father before turning the corner. That was the last time anyone outside the crime saw her. The distance between her front door and the school building was under 2 kilometers. There were no witnesses, no strange vehicles, no sound of struggle. Within less than 10 minutes, she vanished. This type of disappearance is statistically rare. It does not occur without prior planning. The abductor must have known the victim's routine. He must have studied the timing of her commute and identified a stretch of road where visibility was limited and intervention unlikely. The absence of physical evidence, no tire marks, no abandoned belongings, no signs of resistance, strongly suggests the use of a vehicle and the application of force so immediate, the victim had no chance to react. Sabine was likely taken by surprise, pulled into a white van with a sliding door and no rear windows. The suspect, later identified as Marc Dutroux, maintained a calm demeanor, refrained from verbal threats, and instead administered a sleeping pill masked by a drink. When the drug failed to take full effect, he used a blanket to muffle her screams and possibly restraints to limit movement. The psychological intention was clear. Dutroux was not seeking attention or ransom. He was building a world where he alone dictated reality. From the moment Sabine entered the vehicle, her exposure to any external stimuli ceased. Her identity, her autonomy, even her understanding of time were methodically stripped away. She was transported to one of Dutroux's properties in Marcinelle, a suburban house with a concealed basement constructed specifically for confinement. The access point was hidden behind a movable metal shelf in a storage area. No ventilation except a crude fan, no natural light. The descent into the chamber was physical, but also psychological. It was designed to sever orientation, to eliminate the concept of day and night. Upon arrival, Sabine was placed into the steel box, folded, silent, unseen. There were no cameras, no intercom, no emergency release. Just a locking mechanism on the outside and the echo of her own breathing inside. This method of confinement suggests a calculated detachment from the consequences of prolonged isolation. Dutroux was not only attempting to remove the girl from society, but to reprogram her sense of worth, beginning with her sensory deprivation. By the time she was removed from the crate and chained to a metal frame inside the yellow room, she had already begun to experience the first effects of cognitive disassociation. The body present, but the self suspended. She was told not to speak. She was told her parents had refused to pay. She was told she had been forgotten. These statements served no purpose in negotiation. They were part of a framework designed to destroy resistance by replacing hope with submission. The fact that Sabine's disappearance was not immediately recognized as an abduction is critical. The initial delay in action gave Dutroux time to solidify control, to reinforce the lie that no one was coming. This manipulation is consistent with known behaviors in long-term captivity cases, where the perpetrator seeks not just physical dominance, but the total surrender of the victim's belief in rescue. Back in the chamber, the steel crate remained in the corner, its hinges dark with oil. It would not be used again, but its presence served as a message that silence could always be enforced. Every object in the room had a purpose, and none of it served the child. The food was rationed, the blankets were unwashed, the air was heavy, and above all, the rules were absolute. And from that moment, she ceased to exist above ground. The structure of captivity began with silence. No clocks, no windows, no cycles of light or sound that marked the passage of time. Within the yellow-painted room, routine was not measured by hours, but by the reappearance of one man, always alone, always deliberate. His movements were slow, his instructions limited. The primary rule was unspoken but absolute. Obedience preserved survival. The prisoner was chained to a bunk bed ladder using a short steel link. It restricted movement to roughly 1 square meter, just enough to sit, shift, and reach a plastic container placed beside the mattress. Personal hygiene was not encouraged. The air was humid, and no ventilation system operated with consistency. The only contact with the outside world came in the form of manufactured information, a tactic used not to deceive in a practical sense, but to collapse the boundary between fiction and memory. Dutroux's psychological strategy combined deprivation with illusion. Over the first days, he delivered verbal messages claiming that Sabine's parents had refused to pay a ransom. This was a calculated effort to dismantle emotional anchoring. For a child, the belief in abandonment by one's caretakers functions as a cognitive trauma, comparable to physical assault. It initiates internal collapse, leading the victim to replace external trust with internal compliance. To reinforce this distortion, he produced handwritten notes, forged letters purportedly from her family. These were brief, impersonal, and cold, crafted to suggest deliberate rejection. The syntax was carefully neutral, avoiding overt cruelty, which made them more plausible. The combination of claimed messages and emotional void formed the core of a psychological conditioning method aimed at eroding resistance without the use of physical force. The delivery of food occurred once daily. The menu was restricted: old bread, expired milk, processed canned goods. The unpredictability of delivery time contributed to the disintegration of temporal awareness. At times, he omitted meals entirely. These irregularities produced physiological stress and reinforced the perception that all survival depended solely on his discretion. The prisoner was never struck. She was instead made to fear absence, the delay of food, the delay of words, the delay of any interaction at all. Medication played a supplementary role. Pills were offered without identification. When questioned, Dutroux insisted they were vitamins or required for digestion. On several occasions, he demanded they be swallowed under observation. The use of medication here was not for sedation, but for dominance, forcing submission through bodily intrusion. In at least one instance, the girl was forced to take a tablet she had attempted to hide, resulting in her being verbally reprimanded and denied food for the next cycle. These episodes were not punishment in the classical sense, but behavioral correction within an artificial logic designed entirely by the captor. Reinforcement of passivity was embedded in environment. Toys were introduced selectively. A game console with only one cartridge, a notebook with dull pencils, a children's magazine months out of date. These objects were not gifts. They were conditioning tools. Their presence served to simulate normalcy, to lull the prisoner into confusion about the reality of her situation. When asked simple questions, her name, her age, the date. She hesitated, not due to resistance, but due to uncertainty. In behavioral analysis, the subject displayed signs of learned helplessness after 2 weeks. Attempts at protest ceased. Verbal responses became shorter. Facial expressions flattened. These were not signs of adaptation, but symptoms of forced mental disengagement, the self-preserving mechanism of a captive made to believe no alternative exists. The captor's demeanor remained dispassionate. He neither raged nor comforted. His authority was expressed through absence more than presence. He left the girl alone for hours, sometimes more than a day, without warning. This withdrawal created a paradox. The child feared the man, but also feared his vanishing. The psychological tether between captive and captor deepened as a survival response, not affection, but necessity. At the start of the week 4, a deviation occurred. Sabine noticed that Dutroux had become more distracted. He spoke less. He forgot minor routines, delivering a spoon, replacing a light bulb. His behavior suggested strain or the presence of a new variable beyond the chamber. On day 38 of her captivity, she heard movement above that did not match the usual pattern. The door opened later than expected. When he entered, he did not speak. Behind him, another figure was partially visible, smaller, thinner, motionless. Sabine saw only a glimpse, but it was enough to confirm what she feared and hoped at once. Another girl had arrived. But when a second girl appeared, the equilibrium fractured. The introduction of a second captive disrupted the established behavioral pattern. Until this point, the perpetrator had maintained complete authority through isolation, controlled information, and environmental deprivation. The sudden presence of another victim, Laetitia Delhez, initiated an unforeseen psychological dynamic, one that shifted the power equilibrium inside the chamber. The new arrival was 14 years old, semi-conscious, likely under the influence of administered sedatives. She was placed in the same space, but chained separately. The initial silence between the two captives reflected the learned helplessness previously instilled in the first victim. However, over the next several hours, the older girl began to regain awareness. She asked basic questions. She observed her surroundings. She noticed details, names, objects, routines, that contradicted the narrative previously constructed by the captor. Communication between the girls started cautiously. Whispered exchanges, careful phrasing, and periods of silence punctuated by short, factual statements. The younger captive learned for the first time that she was not alone. More critically, she was told her face was on national posters, that the public was searching, and that she had not been forgotten. This revelation directly countered the psychological framework imposed by Dutroux, the fiction of abandonment that had previously shaped her compliance. In forensic psychology, the presence of a co-victim introduces a variable that undermines control. The captor must now manage not only two individuals, but also the bond that forms between them, a bond defined by shared trauma and a mutual awareness of captivity. The resulting solidarity can foster resistance, both internal and behavioral. The captor's behavior shifted accordingly. His visits became shorter, more erratic. He began speaking less, avoiding eye contact, and minimizing exposure to questions. In at least one documented instance, he allowed the captives to prepare their own food, indicating a breakdown in micromanagement. He stopped bringing manipulated letters. He ceased offering explanations. His control mechanism, previously dependent on psychological manipulation, began to collapse under the weight of new interpersonal dynamics he had not anticipated. Sabine and Laetitia exchanged timelines. They mapped what they remembered. They recalled sounds from above. They identified objects that had changed position. This subtle exchange of information created an internal cognitive structure, a shared memory system that could later be used to reconstruct events. More importantly, It demonstrated that both captives retained higher-order cognitive function, despite prolonged deprivation. Environmental conditions remained poor. Hygiene was minimal. Lighting remained dim. The air was still thick with mold and iron. However, the mental state of the captives showed signs of stabilization, even mild defiance. They requested items. They questioned orders. They began to observe Dutroux not with fear, but with analysis. This role reversal, the captor becoming the subject of scrutiny, often signals the beginning of loss of control in captivity models. Dutroux responded with behavioral withdrawal. On August 12th, he brought no food. On August 13th, he failed to appear. On August 14th, he re-entered briefly, said nothing, and exited again. His absences grew longer. This retreat was not strategic. It was a reaction to a loss of dominance. Having built an environment based entirely on psychological dependence, he was now faced with an emerging structure beyond his control. Two minds, communicating, calculating, remembering. On August 15th, the captor failed to return. No supplies, no instructions. The girls waited. They rationed what remained: water, crackers, canned beans. They listened for footsteps. None came. The silence, once a tool of oppression, became an indication of opportunity. That same day, Belgian authorities launched a raid on Dutroux's residence in Marcinelle, acting on testimony from an associate who had witnessed suspicious activity. The basement was discovered behind a concealed wall. Law enforcement breached the chamber. Both girls were found alive. And just then, for the first time, he left and never came back. The basement room was sealed from behind a false wall, constructed with prefabricated concrete and reinforced shelving. When law enforcement officers breached the chamber, the air was dense with mold, stagnant moisture, and the residual odor of confined human presence. Both victims were located chained but conscious, displaying symptoms of malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological shock consistent with prolonged captivity under coercive control. Their extraction marked the beginning of an extensive forensic operation. Initial inspection of the residence revealed architectural irregularities, concealed compartments, false floors, and overlapping electrical conduits. Each of these was purpose-built to sustain isolation, suppress sound, and delay detection. The structure reflected a deliberate design incompatible with impulsive behavior. It suggested a premeditated system for the containment of multiple victims over time. The suspect, Marc Dutroux, was apprehended within hours. During preliminary interrogation, he provided limited cooperation, but ultimately led investigators to a second property in Sars-le-Buissière. There, beneath a loosely cultivated garden plot behind the home, investigators uncovered two makeshift graves. Each was marked only by a disturbed surface layer and faint soil depression. No headstones, no coverings, no indicators of humanity. Excavation teams exhumed the remains of two missing minors, identified through dental records as Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo. Both victims had been reported missing over a year prior. Autopsy findings confirmed death by starvation and prolonged neglect. The timeline aligned precisely with the period when Dutroux had been incarcerated for a separate offense. His absence during their decline indicates either abandonment or the complicity of a secondary caretaker. Further analysis would later implicate his partner, Michelle Martin, in failing to intervene. At a third location, authorities recovered the body of Bernard Weinstein, a known associate. He had been bound, gagged, and buried in a shallow grave on the property. Forensic inspection of the remains revealed trauma to the cranium, consistent with blunt force injury. Traces of sedatives were found in his bloodstream, indicating incapacitation prior to death. Testimony from Dutroux suggested Weinstein had knowledge of the confinement system and posed a liability. His elimination was a strategic act to contain risk. This act marked a transition in the offender's psychological state, from manipulation to disposal, from secrecy to containment through violence. Crime scene units cataloged extensive material evidence, including tools, construction plans, restraints, and a series of labeled video recordings. The contents of the tapes were sealed under court order, but their existence reinforced the assumption that documentation was part of the ritual. The recordings served no tactical purpose in the crime, but rather acted as psychological reinforcement for the perpetrator, a record of domination preserved for review. The structural consistency across multiple properties reflected a pattern. Each location served a specific phase: abduction, containment, disposal. The criminal infrastructure was not opportunistic. It followed a modular logic: abduct in location A, confine in location B, bury in location C. This compartmentalization minimized exposure and spread risk across geography and time. The distribution of assets demonstrated logistical planning far beyond the capacity of spontaneous offending. Michelle Martin, initially uncooperative, later admitted to knowledge of the victim's presence during Dutroux's incarceration. Her inaction, sustained over weeks, contributed directly to the death of both minors. The psychological profile of her role suggests submission reinforced by dependence, not ignorance. She participated in the concealment of evidence, provision of minimal sustenance, and facilitation of domestic normalcy above ground. As investigators widened their search, public reaction intensified. Demonstrations erupted across Belgium, culminating in a mass protest known as the White March. Over 300,000 citizens mobilized, expressing not only grief, but systemic outrage. The protest did not target the offender alone. It questioned institutional delay, prior warnings ignored, and judicial leniency previously granted to Dutroux. Review of archived files revealed he had received early parole following a conviction for prior sexual offenses. Despite multiple red flags, including property purchases under false names, documented psychiatric instability, and associates with criminal histories, monitoring was minimal. 2 prior police searches of the same property, where the girls were later found, had failed to breach the concealed compartment. Complaints of suspicious activity had been logged, then disregarded. This failure was not isolated. It was distributed across departments, jurisdictions, and administrative layers. The success of the captivity model did not rely solely on the cunning of the perpetrator. It thrived on the inertia of systems designed to prevent it. Marc Dutroux constructed the framework, but one question remained: who let this happen? The courtroom in Arlen was not merely a space for legal proceedings. It became a site of national catharsis, an architecture of confrontation, where the survivors, the accused, and the failed mechanisms of justice stood exposed before a nation that had waited nearly a decade for resolution. Marc Dutroux entered the chamber under heavy guard. His demeanor was alternately defiant and evasive. At times, he appeared lucid, capable of articulating sequences of events. At others, he spiraled into conspiratorial narratives, shifting blame onto unnamed accomplices and alleging structural corruption. The inconsistency of his statements suggested more than manipulation. It reflected a fractured inner schema, one common in individuals whose power derived from isolation and whose reality collapsed when exposed to public scrutiny. Michelle Martin sat separately. Her presence drew visible contempt from observers, but her testimony revealed a subtler pathology. When questioned about her silence during Dutroux's imprisonment, when 2 girls starved to death inside her home, she did not deny awareness. Instead, she described an internal paralysis. Her language lacked urgency. She spoke of waiting for instructions, of not wanting to make things worse. These phrases revealed a learned passivity, a psychological dependency shaped over years of subjugation. She did not act because she no longer perceived herself as possessing the authority to intervene. The trial extended for months, slowed by procedural disputes, psychiatric evaluations, and the complexity of the charges. The surviving victims, Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez, testified under controlled conditions. Their accounts were consistent. They described spatial details, behavioral patterns, and manipulation tactics with clarity. Their testimony was not merely evidence. It was an act of reclamation. Sabine, in particular, articulated the long-term effects of captivity: insomnia, dissociation, compulsive self-monitoring. These were not temporary reactions, but entrenched psychological sequelae, markers of trauma sustained in a state of prolonged dependency and fear. Clinical assessments confirmed symptoms of complex PTSD. These effects were not alleviated by the recovery of freedom, they were activated by it. In freedom, the absence of imposed structure reopened unresolved memories, and recovery became indistinguishable from re-exposure. During closing arguments, prosecutors presented a full architecture of Dutroux's operations: a network of properties, a history of prior convictions, documented failures by police to act on multiple tips, and patterns of coercive dominance over co-offenders. The court ruled that his actions constituted premeditated abduction, rape, torture, and murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Michelle Martin received 30 years. Her early release, years later, would reignite public outrage. This case did not conclude with conviction. It fractured public trust. Parliamentary inquiries revealed systemic errors: files lost, judges reassigned, warrants delayed. Law enforcement bodies failed not because they lacked information, but because they failed to believe the implications of what they knew. When behavior fell outside the threshold of their procedural models, they defaulted to disbelief. The Dutroux case was not merely a sequence of crimes. It was an ecosystem of negligence in which a predator thrived. Institutions failed because they interpreted deviance as anomaly, not pattern. Neighbors called, police visited, and still, a hidden door in a basement remained untouched. Forensic psychology has long recognized that extreme predation rarely occurs in isolation. It requires blind spots, enablers, and moments when procedure outranks instinct. This case confirmed that evil, when methodical, appears ordinary until it is too late. Society did not fail for lack of warning. It failed because it underestimated the persistence of those who calculate in the dark.